Okay then, let's get underway. I'm Adam Bolton. I've been a political journalist for a long time, pretty much representing all those interests that Pippa Crerar just told us they were driving out the lobby. But it's a delight to be here. In fact, the first Sky News political office was in a very mysterious floor -2 of this building, which I doubt you'll ever be able to get there. Anyway, we are going to talk about British politics after Brexit, with particular reference, please, to the Conservative and Labour Party. I know there'll be people who want to hear about the other parties, but that's why there are other sessions talking about that. Now, your questions are coming into us on Slido. And a very important thing, please, is to vote for other people's questions if you've got one, because those are the questions that rise to the top of the question pool. So please do use Slido, and as you can, it was explained by Anand, you can either use that thing or log on to Slido, putting in the number of this event, which is 62401. And even I managed to make it work, so it can't be that difficult. Now, we're going to basically have a question and answer discussion session, but I am just going to ask each of our very distinguished panelists to give their thoughts on politics after Brexit, with particular reference to the Conservatives and Labour. And let's start with Professor Tim Bale, who you'll all know, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. And actually, in this excellent new book, he wrote about the Conservatives. So, Tim, you got 2 minutes. You wanted 5, but we've negotiated.
OK, thank you very much. Just want to start by saying thank you very much to UK and Changing Europe for producing this great report. You really ought to pick up a copy if you haven't already got one, and for running the event today, and for letting me contribute to the report. I'm not going to reprise my remarks in the report. If you're interested, you can read them there. Basically, the underlying question, I guess, is whether what we've seen in the Conservative Party over the last 5-6 years is simply another episode in a long story of a party with a genius for adapting to the zeitgeist, and in some cases shaping that zeitgeist, or are we seeing a more profound shift? Are we seeing a party that was ostensibly a fairly mainstream centre-right party in the European mode, even though it doesn't necessarily like Europe, morphing into some kind of populist radical right formation? I'm still unsure of the answer to that question, but it may be the case that we will soon get an answer to it, depending on what happens with the response to the Sue Gray report and to the police investigation. If, and we can't say when, but if that report and that police investigation suggests that the Prime Minister misled Parliament, and or that he actually broke the law in so doing so. I think the response of the Conservative Party to that event, or those two events it may be, will function as some kind of litmus test and some kind of answer to that question. I think if the Conservative Party does nothing in response to those events, in other words, if there's no confidence vote, and if that no confidence vote does not oust the Prime Minister, then I think the parallels between the Conservative Party and the Republican Party under Donald Trump, which I anyway for a long time have resisted, will become actually quite uncomfortable, and for some people anyway, irresistible. But so much for the kind of hand-wringing from someone who likes to think of themselves as a Democrat and who believes in the rule of law. The question, I guess, that we can discuss in this session is what that might do to the electoral prospects of the Conservative Party. And I think it's by no means clear at this stage the answer to that particular question.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Next, we're going to hear a Labour perspective from Louise Hay, who is MP for Sheffield Heeley, but also, of course, a member of the Shadow Cabinet for Transport. Please.
Thanks, Adam. Lovely to be here. Thanks ever so much to Anand and all the team for organising today. Look, I represent a seat and a city that voted pretty convincingly to leave the European Union. And looking back on it now, it's not that surprising because 7 years ago when I made my maiden speech in Parliament, I talked about the searing inequality that exists in Sheffield. On one bus route across my constituency, you lose your life expectancy of 12 years. And the conditions that I think that led to that Brexit vote, that people felt that there was a political and economic system that simply wasn't delivering for them. And it was a last gasp attempt at trying to bring about a system that would. Those conditions are still very much there. They've not been addressed. They won't be addressed by the Brexiteers that led that referendum campaign. And in fact, they've been exacerbated. And it's those economic conditions that will very much form the landscape at the next general election, and that the Labour Party need to focus absolutely, relentlessly and ruthlessly on. That economic context is really important. And I think there's three critical things happening at the moment. First, by the end of this Parliament, we'll have experienced almost 2 decades of lost income growth since the financial crisis. Second, we're experiencing and will experience a deepening of a crisis in living standards, which is practically universal for the electorate, with households far less able to cope. And third, after 11 long years in power, growth is forecast to be only around 1% by the end of this Parliament, lower than the decade pre-COVID and well below Labour's record in office. So the ground on which the next election will be fought will be on a very familiar theme, but an absolutely extraordinary and honestly, in my lifetime, unprecedented. People will simply be asking whether they feel better off. And if the answer is no, at the next election, the Conservative Party, 15 years into power, will be asking people to give us one more chance. We caused it, but we can fix it. And Labour are making progress on that key question about economic competence, a question which the electorate really questioned at the last election, on the fundamentals that define whether a party is able to win a general election, on economic competence, on who would make a better Prime Minister, on crime and national security. We're now ahead on all those three questions. And we're earning back our reputation on economic competence at precisely the time the Tories are losing theirs. Not just with the reckless waste that has frightened so many people over the last couple of years, writing off £4 billion during the pandemic, but because this is the end of a decade-long story of economic failure. And I think people across the board are paying the price for that failure. It's a really vicious circle. The Tories' policies fail to deliver growth, and their response is more policies that squeeze growth further. And that's why people are now paying the price with higher taxation. So that's why you'll hear us relentlessly focusing day in, day out on living standards and inflation. And this is particularly pertinent to those so-called red wall voters. Since 2010, their real weekly pay is down 2.1% compared to 1.2% across the board. So this is particularly pertinent in those seats. And so our task at the next general election is pretty simple: to make sure it is framed entirely around the economics and around living standards. And whoever has the most compelling and consistent and coherent narrative for who can drive living standards and jobs in those communities that have been deprived of them for so many years will win the election. Now, there will be those, our opponents, that will attempt to derail that, obviously, and to caricature Labour on the so-called culture wars. So let me address that, because I do think that is the elephant in the room for Labour's electoral coalition. I think we actually do some of these political issues a disservice by lumping everything into the category of culture wars, because they're nothing new. Attempts to portray the progressive left as uber liberal and quick to offend are as old as time. And the vast majority of them should simply be dismissed. But I think some of them need to be tackled head on, and we're doing those issues a disservice by dismissing them as culture wars. And I think it was really telling in Oliver Dowden's recent speech on the so-called war on woke that the one one symbol that he didn't address was taking the knee, a very obvious transatlantic symbol of taking a stand against discrimination. Because I think that proved during that football tournament last year to be a rebuke to the caricature that Oliver Dowden was attempting to paint in these culture wars. During the Black Lives Matter movement in this country, young English working class black men spoke powerfully about their experience of discrimination, not with judgment against those who had not experienced it, but with empathy and understanding, and talked about the impact it had had on their lives. And at the start of the Euros, Priti Patel refused to condemn those who booed people taking the knee during the football. But by the end of the tournament, there were no boos. People were applauding them. And now, across the length and breadth of this country, week in, week out, working class people applaud taking the knee in football stadiums. That is a glimpse of the less divided future that it is possible to build if we talk with empathy and understanding and refuse to condemn the other side and tackle these so-called culture wars head on. Because I think people are far less divided and far more sick of division in this country than some politicians give them credit for. And I think by doing that with empathy and understanding and by building that inclusive vision of the future, that is how Labour can hold together the electoral coalition at the next election. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, let's go straight to a Conservative perspective from Mark Harper, of course, MP for Forest of Dean. Yesterday, claiming a new recruit in Boris Johnson to his COVID recovery group, and fresh from a battle with the doorman over COVID passes. So, Mark, over to you.
Adam, thank you very much. Well, let me keep my remarks brief as you requested. So I just wanted to pick up 2 points, really, which I think are relevant to Brexit and the years that followed. So the first one is, and I think picks up a little bit on the points that Tim touched on at the beginning. So first, I think Brexit and the years since touched a bit on the public's faith in how democracy works in Britain and trust in politicians. And I think part of it for me, I voted Remain in the referendum, but I was very clear that it was a democratic exercise and the public had made a choice. And I then worked very hard to deliver the choice that the public had made. And I think one of the frustrations in the 2016 to 2019 period was the public had made a choice. Most people accepted the choice, even if they hadn't voted that way. And they saw a lot of people in Parliament trying not to deliver the choice. And I have to say, Louise, an awful lot of the Labour Party, even from parts of the country that had voted Brexit, spent a lot of time fundamentally not accepting that the country had voted to leave the European Union, trying their damnedest to make sure we didn't leave, and trying to have another referendum, make people think again, and just not accepting in a democratic country, if you have a referendum, you can have an argument about whether you should or shouldn't have a referendum, but if you have one, and the public makes a decision, then you need to deliver it. And I think that caused a lot of damage to our political system, that a lot of people, and I think part of this is why you saw some of the electoral coalition reshaping, wanted their democratic decision delivered, and that was some of what the 2019 election was about. And I think Tim is right. There is a real sense about trust in politics, and I've made my position very clear on recent events. I want to see all of the facts set out when Sue Gray's report is published, and then I will make a decision, and my colleagues in the Conservative Party will have to make a decision one way or the other. I do think it's sensible to wait for all of the facts. Deciding to change or not change the Prime Minister is a big deal. And I think you therefore want all of the facts, you want a proper process to be underway, and that's taking a little bit longer than we thought because of the Metropolitan Police's investigation, but I think we will have to make that decision when it comes. The second point I wanted to make, because I think this is not always well understood, and Tim's written a lot about the sort of electoral shifting coalitions, is what actually happened in the 2019 election. So my constituency in Gloucestershire, the Forest of Dean, is demographically quite consistent with many red wall seats. It has a proud mining and industrial heritage, although the last coal mines were closed by Harold Wilson in the 60s, but there's a large working class Labour heritage in that seat. It voted Leave, as Louise's constituency did, but actually at the 2019 election, the single biggest issue on the doorstep, with former Labour voters wasn't actually Brexit, despite the fact that the constituency voted almost 60-40 to leave the European Union. It was Jeremy Corbyn. And I had many lifelong Labour voters who were absolutely torn between whether they were going to stay at home or even vote for me, which was a big deal for them, because they absolutely didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to go anywhere near power. And it wasn't just economic competence. Fundamentally, it was they thought he was a threat to the national security of our country, and they didn't want that man anywhere near power. And that, I think, is what shaped a lot of decision-making in 2019. And it's those first-time voters for the Conservatives, which I think the Prime Minister himself said in the speech he gave just after the election when he visited one of those constituencies who'd lent their vote to the Conservative Party. Those are the voters that the polling suggests have been most disappointed by recent events. So the challenge for us is to show those voters that actually they made the right decision when they put their faith in the Conservatives in 2019, and to demonstrate they should continue having that faith. And that is going to be a big challenge for us, and we need to do it. Final thing, just on economics. I agree with Louise, it's going to be a big issue at the next election, but I think there are some fundamental economic facts of life which we have to remind people, which is you have to have priorities. The government has no money of its own. It has to raise money through taxation, and it has to make choices about how you spend it. And I'm afraid over the last decade, the Labour Party still doesn't understand that there is no bottomless pit of money. You have to make choices. Money belongs to the public, and you have to only take what is necessary, and you have to spend it carefully. And we haven't written off money from the pandemic. We borrowed a lot of money. We helped businesses survive. There are millions of people in this country who still have jobs because of the furlough scheme and what the Chancellor did. And that is going to have to be paid off over decades. And we will recover money that was misappropriated. But I'm proud that we helped the country in that way, because if we hadn't done so, we would have a much, much bigger economic challenge. So that's the battleground, I think, ahead of us. Lots of terrain to compete on. And I think you've seen this morning some of the terrain between Louise and I about how we're going to fight that battle over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much indeed. And for our final opening couple of minutes, Patrick Maguire, who is the editor of Red Box, the Times online site.
Thanks very much, Adam. I'm glad Mark has mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, because I think there's no point in having this conversation. As someone who wrote a book about why Labour lost the 2019 election, which, as Louise can tell you, is accurate for as much as a page at a time, it's really important to remember how we got here, and also how the situation both parties find themselves in today compares to them. So in 2019, Labour had a radical left manifesto, had a serious racism problem, had a mutually antagonistic relationship with the media, it had a mass membership, it had a parliamentary party whose relationship with the leadership was basically non-existent, ditto party headquarters, party bureaucracy, that was to varying degrees over the course of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, either completely hostile to the leadership or completely hostile to the PLP, had a close relationship with the major left unions in this country, had a serious divide on Brexit, so much so that the party actually split, if anyone remembers that, and it had a deeply unpopular leader. And, you know, taken together, there is a reason why at the very start of Keir Starmer's leadership, the sort of consensus within that team was the point of this parliament was to restore the Labour Party to working order as a functioning organisation in its own right, let alone a government. And if you take all of those criteria as a list and, you know, tick them off with reference to what's happening today, to varying degrees, they're all no longer true. And that's a remarkable situation, I think, for the Labour Party to find itself in just 2 years after Jeremy Corbyn led it to its worst defeat since 1930, whatever it was. And all the more remarkable considering just how degraded the proper functioning of the political party was in the preceding 4 years. So Keir Starmer has found himself in a situation that I don't think anybody, you know, consistently ahead of the polls, personal ratings comparable to or now consistently better than a Prime Minister who just 6 months ago was master of all he surveyed and was happily telling people that he was eyeing a decade in power. And so we're in a situation that I think few people, even the Labour Party, would have suggested last year, right? Because this time last year, the Labour Party plainly wasn't functioning either, hence the upheaval in Keir Starmer's top team. And if you compare that to the Conservative Party today, I think Mark is an interesting case study. When Mark appears on television, he appears, not just as a distinguished backbench MP and former chief whip, but as chairman of the COVID recovery group. And you could say that of many of Mark's colleagues who appear as sort of faction fighters primarily on television, who represent interests or constituencies of MPs within the Conservative Party. It's quite remarkable comparing the Tory party today is the Tory party that won the 2019 election, because where there is much consensus, actually you're witnessing a party that's in many ways just as factionalised as it was during Brexit. And already, we've spoken a lot about, Mark and Louise have spoken a lot about the economy, where the party was united in 2019 on those key issues, getting Brexit done, defeating Jeremy Corbyn, which I think we always underplay when we analyse the 2019 election and the relative appeal of the people who fought it. Defeating Jeremy Corbyn, that was a huge one. Those two issues have been done, and now I think the Conservative Party is searching for coherence, and the winner of the next election, everything else notwithstanding, will be the party that finds a coherent answer to the issues the previous speakers have all identified. And I think other people within those parties can speak with more authority on whether either is fighting fit organisationally to give that coherent answer to the public. But I think the current state of both that's visible within Parliament and Westminster to journalists and observers sort of speaks for itself.
Well, thank you very much indeed. A lot of big issues raised there, the economy in those opening contributions, the economy, the question of leadership of the main parties, cultural wars, and of course we touched on Brexit and what should be done about Britain's relationship with Europe. But it did strike me this morning, listening to the opening keynote discussion, that we really are in a post-Brexit period when a conference like this can start without a mention of Brexit in that first hour. And then, of course, when we look at a changing Europe, the big issue of the day is clearly not directly related to Brexit and the European Union, but what's happening following what's happening in Ukraine, following the positions taken by Boris Yeltsin, sorry, we got Boris's on the brain, by Vladimir Putin yesterday. And I'm interested that the top question consistently coming in on Slido does actually relate to that. We had one earlier on that was doing well, but has dropped down the tables, which is Putin the main beneficiary of Brexit? But we've got a more specific party political one here from Morag Williamson that's topping the poll. Have the huge Russian donations to the Tory party been a factor in ultimately creating, via Brexit, the destabilisation and threat of war in Eastern Europe? It's a very big question indeed. Mark, do you want to start with it?
Well, no. First of all, there haven't been any Russian donations to the Conservative Party because we don't take money from foreign donors. That would be illegal. People who are British citizens are able to make donations to the Conservative Party.
Quite recent British citizens, some of them. And
but you have to be,
well, who came in on tier one, which you're now stopping.
You have to be a British citizen to donate to British political parties. And if you're a British citizen and you've appropriately loyal to Britain, then you have to, you're perfectly entitled to give money to political parties.
Yeah, okay, we say that, but let's leave out the donations bit, if you like, and the influence which we've seen in this country, in the United States as well, of Russian bot factories and the rest of it. Have they really fed off Brexit and the kind of rise of, and perhaps fired and then exploited the feeling of nationalism, which was a part of Brexit, which of course you didn't support originally?
No, look, I think two things. First of all, I think trying to pretend that Brexit was something to do with the Russians is a load of nonsense. I think British people are perfectly able to make decisions, and Louise set out, I think, very coherently some of the views in her own constituency, which she set out were to do with economics. They weren't to do with being influenced by Vladimir Putin. So I think that's just patronising nonsense about British people's ability to make decisions. They're perfectly capable of making decisions and did so. And trying to pretend Brexit was something to do with
instrumental, but
but pretending that but there is a train of thought that pretends that Brexit was somehow, organised by the Russians, which I just think is nonsense.
Yeah, but Putin is anti-EU and nationalistic, which was an element of.
Well, on the issue about how we deal with Putin, I mean, I think actually the British government's response, both over recent years and indeed more recently on being very robust about sanctions and pushing for a very robust NATO response, demonstrates actually outside the European Union that we've been far more robust than most European Union countries, both from a NATO perspective in terms of reinforcing NATO and European Union members on the borders of Russia, providing them with support, and also pushing for a very, very robust European response. Far more robust, frankly, than, say, the German response, which is limited by their energy insecurity. So I think our response on Russia, I think, has been absolutely robust. And I think the Prime Minister is going to set out lunchtime today a very robust response, far more robust, I think, than the European Union.
Well, I think it's been important that we have shown a cross-party response on this, and as Mark says, a very clear NATO response. And we will obviously support the steps that the Prime Minister sets out to impose sanctions on Putin. But the Tory party does have serious questions to answer about money that it's taken to Russian-linked donors, including those that have come in on Tier 1 visas and are very recent British citizens. And I understand there's a members' club that there are very serious questions to answer. And any penny that the Tory party has taken that is any links to the Russian regime obviously has to be returned in full.
I mean, it used to be the Labour Party that was accused of taking red gold.
No more.
Really not?
But I mean, there have been several pieces of legislation that have not been implemented that were all recommended by the cross-party report into Russia, and the Tories have held back on implementing them, particularly on the economic crime bill, which would have cleared up the City of London and financial issues there linked to Russia. So not only do the Tory party have serious questions to answer about what they have personally taken, they have questions to answer about why they have not implemented that legislation that would have tackled this issue a long time ago.
Yeah, I think Louise makes a good point about the economic crime bill, which is certainly one. If we, that many of Mark's colleagues would make as well. There has been, quite laggardly response from government on that. Although I'd say much more relevant in all of this is something Boris Johnson said this morning. I think it's and this is incumbent upon the government post-Brexit as well. It's a lack of strategic thinking in British foreign policy. Boris said this morning after Cobra that the problem was after 2014 there was no real Western strategy to wean itself off Russian hydrocarbon, to respond in a robust and coordinated way to aggression in Crimea. And the question is not so much whether you can draw a straight line between the wives of oligarchs getting British citizenship and paying to play tennis with the Prime Minister, but does the main foreign policy objective of this government, i.e. Brexit and making a success of it, make it harder for Britain and its European allies to coordinate a long-term, coherent, strategic response based on sort of good and well-oiled diplomatic relationships to Russian aggression? And the amount of, it's a question for discussion whether, the dissonance between the thinking in London and Washington and Paris and Berlin and Brussels in particular is a result of, natural geopolitical differences that are quirks of geography and history or whatever, or whether smoother diplomatic relations over the past 2 or 3 years could have made a difference. I think that's it's arguable from either perspective.
Tim, what do you think? Are there links between Putin and Brexit?
I mean, I think Vladimir Putin, as you suggest, was pleased with Brexit. I don't think he achieved Brexit, as we've already heard. I don't think really you can sustain a case that the Brexit referendum was somehow won by Russian bots, even marginally. So, I think there's an extent to which, obviously, as Patrick has said, it may be the case that our response to what's going on in Crimea might have been better or smoother if we were members of the European Union. We would have still had that kind of coordination reflex that helped, I think, respond to crises over the years. But to be honest, I think, as Patrick has said, that the difference between the attitude of Germany or Italy, for example, has to do with their dependence on Russian energy, which we don't have. That's not to say that we've got the ideal energy solution in this country, because as we know, we face a big crunch in that respect as well, unable really to ensure that we have the kind of energy that would make up for the days when the wind doesn't blow, and we're finding it very difficult to build nuclear power stations in order to replace the coal-fired power stations, the gas-fired power stations that we already have. So we've got an energy crisis, but it's not a Russian energy crisis as far as we're concerned.
Are you worried that perhaps this crisis, a genuine global crisis, gives Boris Johnson the opportunity to occupy the kind of Churchillian role he's wanted for so many times, because electorates do tend to rally behind the leadership at times of war?
Sure, but I think Boris Johnson is almost uniquely incapable of occupying or impersonating that role. The energy crisis that we are experiencing is, of course, has global reasons behind it, but we are almost uniquely exposed to it because of the underregulation of the market, because of the failure to invest long-term in renewables and the failure to tackle energy security in this country. So, this is a result of again, a decade of Tory failure on energy policy that leaves us almost uniquely exposed as a country.
Can I just say, I think you're right to pose that question, Adam, but I think, we're not at war with Russia. This is not a kind of Falkland-style situation for Boris Johnson. I don't think...
he was at the Munich conference, he was applauded, and other leaders said complimentary things about him, which is practically the first time.
I'm just reading Alan Duncan's diaries, actually, about his time at the Foreign Office, and let's say he doesn't exactly cover himself in glory there. He may get applause from some of his fellow leaders, but I don't think the impact on the electorate, if that's what we're thinking about here, is going to be that strong. I'm not saying, it's a faraway country of which we know nothing, and I'm not saying it's not important or it won't dominate the headlines for a while, but I'm not sure it will have the kind of traction that Iraq would have or the Falklands would have. I just don't see it as that kind of situation. I may be wrong.
Patrick, Tim Shipman in the Sunday Times, he was saying this is a godsend, just what Boris Johnson wanted, makes the whole party's thing look trivial.
Well, the audience, there are two audiences that matter for Boris Johnson. One is the electorate, and the polling doesn't suggest they are particularly moved by this in our direction. The second is the parliamentary Conservative Party. And yeah, sure, I'm sure there are Tory MPs, some of them have tweeted to this effect in the past couple of days, who say, actually, this is what matters, and, now would not be the time for a change of leadership. But I'm sure, you heard people saying that in 1990 when Mrs. Thatcher was in Paris, and, we were about to go to war in Kuwait.
Perhaps also an opportunity for Labour to define itself as not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party anymore, as pro-NATO.
I got a slight PTSD listening to Patrick spell out all the challenges we were dealing with in the last Parliament, and I do think we have made extraordinary strides in the last couple of years to move forward on those key kind of metrics that I laid out that are so essential for a party to win a general election. Who looks to be the best Prime Minister? Are you trusted on the economy, and are you trusted on crime and national security? And it is impossible for a party to win a general election unless the public feel they can trust them on those three things. And under Keir Starmer, the former head of the CPS, who literally prosecuted criminals and terrorists, I think we have a perfect leader and a perfect antidote to Boris Johnson at this moment.
What do you think of the politics of this, or is it actually a moment of kind of national unity?
Well, I think it is welcome that there's been cross-party support for the approach the government set out. I think it's helpful if you can have international things like this where you don't get a difference between the two parties. So that is welcome. I mean, I remember back to when we had Salisbury and Jeremy Corbyn was taking the side of the Russians, I mean, explicitly in the House of Commons, which was appalling, frankly. And that's part of...
Certainly not what Keir Starmer's doing.
No, and that's partly why 2019 ended up the way it did. But of course, I would just say, of course, that all those Labour politicians did want Jeremy Corbyn to be the Prime Minister in charge of our national security, and they all campaigned to make him so.
Yeah, but you want Boris Johnson to be Prime.
So it is just worth remembering that. And the question that Tim raised and Patrick raised and which you raised about, the politics of this and the Prime Minister, it kind of depends what you think the Partygate thing is about. I mean, for me, it's about whether people who make the rules follow the rules, and it's about the confidence you have and trust. And actually, at serious times, actually you do want someone at the dispatch box who you can trust. And there will be times, I suspect, during this crisis where, you can't put all of the information you have into the public domain. And sometimes I can remember Prime Ministers, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, there were decisions he had to take where he did kind of have to say to Parliament, you're going to have to trust me because I can't tell you everything.
Although, interestingly, this time,
you
both Washington and London have taken a different approach.
No, that is true. And we have
trying to put out as much
all the intelligence out there
to kind of call Putin's
Well, we've done that on purpose in order to call out Putin. And as I said, what we've seen today is, I think, Putin being slightly cleverer than some people had thought in trying to run this narrative about these breakaway regions to pretend he's not really invading Ukraine. He is, of course, but it does give those people who don't want to have a robust response an excuse not to respond robustly. And I think the fact we called him out means that we can all see what this is about. It is about invading Ukraine. It is about saying Ukraine has no right to exist, which is what Lavrov, the foreign minister, said this morning. And certainly in Britain, we're not going to fall for that. And I hope no other European countries do. And we give a very robust response. And I hope in Parliament today, the Prime Minister will be very robust about it. And in fact, the House of Commons, in a united way, will support the government's very strong position to standing up for a European country, Ukraine, which is independent and sovereign and should be defended to the best of our ability with the tools that we have available.
Let's turn to a big foreign policy question for this country, the relationship with the European Union. A couple of questions here, really looking at it from left and right. First of all, Tim Barrow says, will Red Wall voters continue to vote Tory if they see Brexit being threatened, or might they abandon the Tories if they feel levelling up isn't going to happen? And from the other side, Dominic Brett says to Louise Hay, he directed a question to her, why should any ex-Remainer vote Labour now that you're a pro-Brexit party, which has explicitly ruled out single market and customs union membership? I'm actually going to start with you, Tim, on this. The politics of Brexit now as it feeds into Labour and Conservatives.
Well, I think if you look at the report, you will see that Brexit identities are still quite sticky. It's not the case that people have abandoned them now that they're done, although they have faded somewhat. And of course, it may be that they've got some kind of half-life, which means that they fade even more by the election 2023-24. But they will still be in play to some extent. Whether, as some Conservatives seem to think, you can, as it were, keep those identities boiling by prosecuting some kind of war on woke, seeing Brexit identity as part of this sort of wider complex of values, I'm not so sure. I don't think that many of the people who were persuaded that Brexit was a good idea, although they might be quite socially conservative, necessarily want to see the government, as far as they can see it, waste its time on issues like statues, etc., etc. I do think, in terms of the Red Wall, although I don't really want to kind of fetishise a particular part of the country, it is true to say that delivery is going to be quite important on levelling up. I think, it may be the case that people will be prepared to give the government another go if they see progress on that front. They don't necessarily need to see absolutely everything delivered in time. And of course, we have seen the government direct resources to particular constituencies in quite a savvy way. But, I mean, I would say, and I think it's very interesting listening to Mark, when it comes to the next election, it will be very interesting to see whether that narrative concerning we've spent a lot of money, now we have to begin to think about paying it back, so we can't actually do some of the stuff that we wanted to do, but, you know, we're a very realistic party and Labour's unrealistic. It'll be interesting to see if that will work. I mean, it was quite a powerful kind of narrative in 2010. You know, the money's all been spent and now we have to retrench. I don't know whether people will actually buy it quite so much this time, particularly, of course, because the voters that the Conservative Party need to keep on board from 2019 are precisely people who in 2010 and 2015 didn't actually buy that austerity narrative. So it'll be very interesting to see whether it works this time around.
What do you think, Patrick? Do you think there is still mileage for the Conservatives in being confrontational towards the EU? And obviously the Northern Ireland issue is very much there.
It's a good question, and as an electoral strategy to energise its core vote, you might think so. But I think, and obviously there's one party who is on this panel, and we're not necessarily talking about them, the point of this event. But I think one of the biggest lessons of last year was the return of the Liberal Democrats to its previous status as a sort of catch-all party of sort of local populism, or sort of, you know, an all things to all people party, rather than a party representing half of the electorate, or indeed a small section of that half of the electorate or less that voted to remain. And I think that would be, if I were a Conservative Party strategist, and indeed I know there are people in CCHQ who are employed, well, there's one person in CCHQ who's employed to think about this, or at least make leaflets about it, which, you know, doubles for strategic thinking in British politics most of the time. I think that's the worry for the Conservative Party, that, you know, look at North Shropshire, a seat that demographically had nothing in common with the places the Liberal Democrats did well in 2019. That was a reminder that the Liberal Democrats can now attract, you know, voters, Leave voters in seats with, you know, big numbers of owner-occupiers, not just, you know, the London commuter belt or, you know, the student-heavy inner cities. And I'd say that's a dangerous thing for the Conservative Party, whether, you know, antagonising the EU or energising its new core vote is actually pushing voters towards a party that is once again hospitable to those people.
Now, what about Labour's position vis-à-vis the EU? I mean, a lot of the questioners seem to think that they would like to see Labour becoming more pro-European and more in favour of a closer relationship, possibly, you know, more like Norway or something like that.
Well, of course, we want a pragmatic and close relationship with our nearest and greatest trading partner, and that's why, you know, just before taking on the role of Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, I served as Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, and our solution and our compromise around the protocol was for the UK to negotiate a veterinary agreement with the European Union, which would have in one fell swoop removed the vast majority of checks between Britain and Northern Ireland, and would have put this issue to bed some time ago, and we would have still had a fully functioning government in Northern Ireland. As a result, now Stormont has collapsed, and politicians there aren't able to get on with the job of delivering on the fundamental issues that are facing the people of Northern Ireland at the moment. So the government has completely failed there. And I think, you know, Boris Johnson will attempt to weaponise this, and we've heard him in the last few weeks in PMQs accusing Keir Starmer of voting to rejoin the EU on several occasions. But I think, you know, as I said in my opening remarks, the economic conditions that I believe led in large part to the vote to leave the European Union have not been addressed, cannot be addressed by Brexiteers, and they reveal that fundamental tension in the Tory party at the moment that was so tellingly revealed with Michael Gove's Levelling Up white paper just a few weeks ago, in which he really compellingly spelled out the problems facing communities, mostly in the North and the Midlands, but then failed to come up with any of the solutions. He sort of gave a nod to it, in which he said he believed that we needed to have a much more interventionist, much more activist government, but then that was followed just a week later by Steve Barclay saying we needed to roll back the step.
But I mean, does Labour have to accept the type of Brexit which Boris Johnson ended up taking the country in? I mean, Labour could it not say, well, we do want closer trade links, for example, and we will be prepared to accept not a political membership, but more trade cooperation.
I mean, and I think Keir spelled that out in his conference speech when he said, it's not just get Brexit done, it's make Brexit work. And that deal is a starting point that we voted for in Parliament, from which we would negotiate further agreements in order to smooth the trading relationship, not least in order to protect the union.
What do you think? I mean, you're going to lose the red wall if you nuance your position a bit.
No, I think on what we call red wall voters, so those people that had made a decision to vote Brexit, I think we've delivered on it in the sense we've left the European Union. I think one of the problems that we had post 2016 was this idea that somehow you could nuance it. The fact is, the reason why it was such a difficult decision and difficult to implement is it's binary. You can't sort of be in the European Union, which is why this idea that you can join the single market and the customs union and sign up to free movement and still not be in the European Union was nonsense. You can't.
Well, it is done.
Yes, but the problem is you're then in the European Union. If you're signing up, if you're signing up to all the rules, and you have no say over any of them, you are effectively in the European Union without any of the democratic control.
The issue is you're not signing up to all the rules. You're signing up to some of them.
The fundamental problem was that if you're not in the EU and you're not shaping the rules, you shouldn't be following them. And that was the big argument we had. And I think the reason why I voted against.
But hang on, trade is a two-way street, right?
Correct.
And when you enter into trade agreements with any country, you agree to common standards and common
on
rules.
the things you're trading, not on the rest of the economy.
What you're advocating, or the hard Brexit position, basically says we don't cooperate. So not surprisingly, we don't get the trade.
No, it's saying that you sign up to rules for things you trade. What you don't do is sign up to control the rest of your economy that you don't trade, and you also don't sign up to free movement, and you sign up to an immigration system that doesn't work for you. You design one that works for your own country and your own needs. And fundamentally, that was the argument we had over Brexit, which is people that didn't accept that there was a choice, and the public made a choice, and we needed to deliver it. So I think we've made that decision, and I think we've accepted it.
So you don't envisage
it.
a closer trading relationship developing with Britain outside the European Union in the coming year?
Not if you mean by that joining the single market or a customs union and having to sign up not just for rules on goods, but on managing the whole of our economy, which is what part of the argument was about and why I opposed Theresa May's deal.
Room for
Let me come back on levelling up when you've done that as well.
Well, you heard what he said. I mean, do you in Labour agree with that there is no way of getting a closer, more cooperative trade relationship?
No, I think we've spelled out on several occasions various agreements, not least a veterinary agreement. I mean, that doesn't, it's not customs union or no trading relationship. There is a more pragmatic, more consensual approach that we could take to negotiations with the European Union, which Boris Johnson and previously
including
Lord
agreeing
France.
some rule taking from Brussels.
Well, as you say, I mean, trade agreements are based on a common recognition of rules on our goods and what we trade. So that is a pragmatic, that is the appropriate response.
Now, what about this erosion of the red wall?
So I think we do need to look at the things we promised, and we need to deliver on them. So I think levelling up for me actually is about spreading opportunities. So it's partly about infrastructure. It's partly about opportunities for people to get on. It's for better schools. It's for more skills. It's for lifelong skills. It's for that whole raft of things that Michael Gove set out in the white paper. And it's not just, by the way, it's not a north-south issue. There are large parts of the south of England, my own constituency, and areas where you've got parts of communities where they haven't had those opportunities. And my constituency had a bid for some funding for opportunities for what you would call levelling up, which was about skills. It was about giving people from certain parts of the constituency more opportunities. We need to see more of that over the next couple of years to make a start on that, to show people that we meant what we said. And that's what I think Michael Gove kicked off with his white paper.
I think, Tim, is evidence in this, just reading the report or skimming it this morning, that there are some people saying that while Brexit identity is still very strong, Brexit identity is no longer tied as strongly to which party people end up backing. Is that...
Well, I mean, the links are still there, but you're right to say that, possibly they've eroded a little bit. I mean, I think this question of, delivery, in 2 years' time is a really interesting one. It's how far people are willing to give government the benefit of the doubt that they've started and they will actually finish the job. And I think there may be a fatal contradiction for the Conservative Party if, on the one hand, they're trying to persuade people that that is the case, and on the other hand, they're running a narrative which is, we've spent an awful lot of money and now we're going to have to retrench it. Because one of the things that is absolutely crucial to understand about the 2019 election is that the other side, as it were, of the get Brexit done phrase, which was and unleash Britain's potential. And a very, very big part of the reason why people were persuaded to switch to the Conservatives was because they were going to get Brexit done in order to focus on the things that people really cared about. And the things that people really cared about was what they saw as the underfunding of public services over the last 10 years. So you will absolutely, as the Conservative Party, have to make sure that you do not renege on those promises, particularly with regard to the National Health Service. And if you are going into an election with, 4 million people on the waiting list, that, I think, is going to be quite a difficult argument to run. And I think, he's right about the standard of living, the cost of living crisis. I was just reminded, actually, when she was talking, of something that Ronald Reagan said to voters in a presidential debate in 1980 with Jimmy Carter. He said, ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And I think if Labour manages to make that the question, irrespective of the excuse that, the pandemic has, caused us problems, I think the Conservative Party may have more difficulty winning that election than perhaps some people think.
Now, a couple of questions have come in, and since, this is a political conference, so how we could not discuss it, about electoral reform. We've got Jenny Wilson saying, should we be focusing on getting PR? It now seems to be the only solution short of reversing Brexit. And then Owen Winter, he says, with a large majority of Labour members and increasing numbers of trade unions calling for proportional representation, is it something that Labour is going to back? Now, this is all, seems to me, related to this question which you've raised quite rightly with the Liberals of a progressive alliance, whether formal or informal, as being the greatest threat to the Conservatives at the next election.
Yes, but it doesn't necessarily follow that, cooperation, tacit or formalised or otherwise, between Ed Davey and Keir Starmer on whether you do, the Labour just does a free post in St Albans or has, several teams of canvassers in, St Albans or Esher and Walton. It doesn't necessarily follow that the answer is then for Labour to back proportional representation, because the reason, the Progressive Alliance thing, be it formalised or otherwise, is clearly paying dividends. If you look at the way the Labour share of the vote went in North Shropshire, ditto Chesham and Amersham, right, that's clearly paid dividends for the Liberal Democrats and is going to work for Labour. And, perhaps it will work in 30 or so seats at our next first past the post general election. But, I mean, it's a bit of a leap of logic, to say the least, to then presuppose that the relationships between Labour and Liberal Democrats will remain frozen in aspic, if then a Labour government introduces proportional representation. Because look at what happened between 1997 and 2010. 1997, you have Paddy Ashdown writing in his diaries that, I think Blair's going to give me a seat in the cabinet and he's going to, go the full Monty. 2010, Nick Clegg is David Cameron's deputy prime minister. I mean, something I think progressives, and I assume there are, most people in the audience would self-identify as progressives who, whose main objective is to, lock the Conservatives out of power through any means necessary. The risk is that in a proportional system, be it, no matter how you're electing your MPs, the risk is that it just gives the Conservatives aren't locked out of power. They just have to find a coalition partner. And history suggests that, if you're Jeremy Thorpe or if you're Paddy Ashdown or if you're Nick Clegg, your answer to who you're willing to cooperate with depends on lots of things. And most of the time, it's as much parliamentary arithmetic as it is principle. That's the reason You had a Lib Lab pact between, David Steele and Wilson and Callaghan in the 70s wasn't necessarily because of anything other than parliamentary arithmetic, right? So as much as them being ideologically simpatico. So I think people should be careful what they wish for, even if a degree of cooperation between the Liberal Democrats and Labour works this time round in delivering a government that progressives would like to see.
Also, proportional representation in European elections, arguably, actually, from a progressive point of view, backfired because it enabled the...
Gave UKIP a pulpit and, several, dozens of publicly subsidised salaries and broadcasting rights that they wouldn't have never had before. So, again, be careful what you wish for.
You tempted?
I think this is, it's seen as a kind of shortcut, really, these kind of progressive alliance debates and talk about proportional representation. In those marginal seats that we need to win government, even if you added the Labour and Lib Dem vote together, we still would be second. So our problem at the last general election wasn't that we weren't working with other progressive parties, it was that too many people voted for the Conservatives, and that's what we need to win back, and there's no shortcuts to that. I also think voters are much more discerning and able to get what they want than we give them credit for. I don't think, people don't need to be told in certain seats where Labour are third to vote Lib Dem in order to get the Tories out. They know how to tactically vote, and I think we should give them credit for. So I think our job is much greater than this at the next general election. And I think these kind of debates always happen on the left, when we don't want to make those hard strides.
We're told, though, that you are getting to know your Liberal Democrat MPs, that there is a kind of warmth developing, that whether it's most likely to be informal, that the fact of the matter is that Labour has a better chance of being the largest party if the Liberal Democrats do well, doesn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, the Lib Dems are second in a lot of Tory seats.
Yeah.
Those will be straight up battles. We need the Lib Dems to do well in the southwest in order to get rid of some Tory MPs. There's no doubt about that. But believe me, coming from Sheffield, I don't feel much warmth to the Lib Dems.
Well, that's one seat I think you're bound to fight very hard. Nick Clegg's old seat, isn't it? Well, are you worried about a progressive alliance or more organised?
Well, the two questions, the two that specifically came in on PR. I mean, we had a referendum, picking up referendum point on changing the voting system about 10 years ago, and the public were very clear they didn't want to change the voting system, and I was the minister that took the legislation through Parliament to have that referendum. So I think the public made a clear decision on that. On the progressive alliance, my view is that this is a test for us, really, as Conservatives. Activists on the left view the whole world, I think, in the way Louise just set out, as voting is about getting rid of the Conservatives. Normal people, non-left-wing activists, view the world around who do they want to be running the country. And I think if we set out a compelling, attractive vision about opportunity and what the Conservatives are about, people will then make a judgment about that, and I don't think we then need to be worried about.
But I mean, there are.
The only time a progressive alliance type model is a problem is if normal people's primary objective is getting rid of the Conservative Party. If that's the case, they just work out who's the most effective way of doing that. The way we combat that is not arguing about progressive alliances and voting systems. It's about setting out an attractive vision for the country, about opportunity, about giving ordinary people the best possible chance to control their own lives. If we do that, then more people will vote for us, will win, and then the whole argument about progressive alliances and PR doesn't become a thing.
But there are, and this has happened, it happened with the Blair government, and it's happened now with Boris Johnson. There are a lot of people, normal people, perhaps people, not following politics all the time, who just think that there's something a little bit wrong with getting less than half the votes and getting a massive parliamentary majority, and that something needs to be done to fix the system.
Tony Blair got less than half the votes.
No, I agree. I'm not saying this is anti-conservative.
No.
But it's a problem with our system that is pretty apparent.
Well, there's two things I take. First of all, you do have to be careful what you wish for, because it is worth just remembering there are times over the last few years where actually if you'd had a PR system, the coalition government you might well have got would be the Conservatives and UKIP, because that's what the numbers suggested. So those people who think that there was a progressive alliance, I think are a bit, you think that's the inevitable outcome, are a bit foolish. And PR systems don't stop centre-right progressive mainstream parties on the right getting into.
I didn't say they did, but I just said there was.
I just think this is a bit of a red herring. The challenge for us is about, as I said, setting out a compelling argument for ordinary voters to have the best opportunities they can. If we do that, all of this argument about progressive alliances all becomes a bit pointless.
Tim.
Irrelevant.
Well, I mean, I think if we are to get PR in this country, you're going to have to see the Labour Party and indeed the Liberal Democrats do it without a referendum. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to get it through on a referendum. And of course, a lot of people will object to a major change, constitutional change like that without a referendum. But I can't see it happening unless, for example, there's a promise of a kind of royal commission on the electoral system and a promise to then implement the recommendation of that royal commission. Whether you can do that without a referendum, I think will be really, really interesting to see.
And we've had a Labour government with a massive majority do exactly that before.
Yeah, and not and not do anything. So we'll see about that. In terms of the Progressive Alliance, I mean, I think there's a very interesting point made about, well, voters know how to get rid of a Conservative government. And I think that was certainly true in 1997. But actually, the research on what voters know about their constituency shows that they're pretty good at knowing who won, but they're not very good at remembering who came second, interestingly enough. So if there is to be this kind of implicit Progressive Alliance, there will have to be some voter education undertaken. Not simply Lib Dem bar charts and kind of can't win here. There will have to be quite a lot done, which is quite difficult when you want to avoid any kind of formal tie-up. So it will be interesting to see whether that can happen. I mean, certainly, however, it is the case now, some of the research that we've done suggests that it is increasingly obvious, even if it isn't necessarily obvious to voters, that Labour can win in some places and the Liberal Democrats can win in others. So in other words, there isn't so much of a blurred line there. It should be easier to educate voters, but there will be some education required.
Right, let's talk a little bit about the political battleground as it stands now. And of course, we've got local elections coming up in May. Got a question in from John Curtis here. He says, average Labour tally in the last 6 polls, 39%. Average Labour tally in December 2020, 39%. Oh, why no progress in spite of the government's many problems?
Well, I think, so talking to my former Labour, very recently Tory voters in Sheffield, I think some have come back, but not all are making the leap directly. And I think the polling demonstrates that quite significant numbers of very recently Tory voters, when you dig down into the polls, when you're not given an option, or either don't know or potentially not voting. So we've still got a bit of work to do to make them take the journey back. And I think those voters did feel incredibly disrespected by our approach to Brexit and our approach to how they voted in the referendum. And it is going to take some work to win them back. But this local election, I think there will be a significant backlash against Boris Johnson and his Conservative government and the way he has run the party. Because of Partygate, undeniably, and I think I've noticed particularly women in my constituency are horrified by by Partygate and by the way that he set the rules and then refused to follow them. And I've had people coming up to me who are lifelong Tory voters saying that they simply couldn't vote for him again. But also, as I mentioned earlier, on living standards. And, it's impossible.
And not voting for him is different from voting for Labour.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
But then in 97, Tony Blair put on 2 million Labour votes and the Tories lost 4 million. There is a job of work to do to win a lot of those votes back. But the conditions are very good for us to do well in these local elections. And as I say, if we can make the next general election about whether you feel better off, the Tories will be in an impossible position to demonstrate that they are the party to fix that and to make people feel better off in the future, because they have caused this crisis in living standards that people are facing.
Do you think John Curtis is right? No progress being made by Labour?
Well, we do a YouGov poll with the Times every week, and every week I don't necessarily look at, well, I do look at the main voting intention figures, but that's basically just noise. As Louise sort of said there, what you need to do is go straight to the 2019 Tory voter column and look at where the voters are going. And it's certainly true that this year, right now, as was the case last year, the fluctuations in the Tory vote are driven primarily by their own voters becoming undecided or indeed refusing to vote at all, rather than a massive defection to Labour. Now, at the height of Partygate over the last month, the number of direct defectors from the Tories to Labour, it sort of bounces around 5 or 6%. So this time last month it was 9 or 10. Now it's back down to 5. And the challenge to Keir Starmer is to find an offer that convinces more of them to make the switch. And I think another important figure beneath the bonnet of the polling is Keir Starmer's personal numbers, which for a long time haven't been great. They're improving, but he still doesn't enjoy a huge lead. And then, of course, the other data points that are interesting are economic credibility, as well as the best Prime Minister figure. Again, you'll see Labour ahead in a few polls at the minute, but it's not a sustained or particularly massive lead in most polls. The challenge for Labour is to sustain that, and we'll get an early indication of whether Keir Starmer's efforts to detoxify the party's brand will sort of bearing fruit in May. And the question there, as John Curtis will no doubt tell us before and after that poll, is not necessarily how many seats. You'll have read them out before on those marathon, over telethons where you say, oh, the Tories are down 700 councillors, Labour are up 400, and those numbers don't make a huge amount of sense to people. I think there are some key councils this year in the West Midlands, which for years has been a barometer of the health of Labour's brand in what you might call traditional Labour seats. Much more to a certain extent than the Red Wall. As we commonly understand it, right? The West Midlands, your Dudleys, etc., are really crucial seats. If Labour can win back some of those councils, make serious headway in some of those councils, as they couldn't in, say, 2018-19, in 2018, the last round of these locals where Labour were expected to do really well, didn't, and that was a sign that, Corbynism wasn't perhaps the hot ticket it had seemed the previous year at a general election. If Labour can do well in the places it conspicuously didn't do well in 2018, then, actually, we might see more meaningful progress than John Curtis has identified so far.
So are the Conservatives worried? I mean, would things be improved if Boris Johnson wasn't there, given the baggage he's now carrying?
Well, look, I think the thing that I agree with what Patrick said there is about if you look at those 2019 Conservative voters and where they've gone. So the fact is, at the moment, there's a chunk of them that have said they don't know who they'd vote for, and they currently wouldn't vote for us, but they haven't switched to the Labour Party, and it's that primarily that's driving the headline polls. Now, for me, I look at that actually as an opportunity for us, because those are people that we haven't lost. They're people who are currently a bit annoyed with us, but actually, if we set out a compelling vision, then I think we can get them back. And I just slightly pick up on the point that Tim raised there. I wasn't saying about the money we spent during the pandemic in some way that had to be paid back quickly, and that meant we had to retrench. The point I was making was, we made a big call there to support people, and I think actually people recognise that. The point is, though, you can't go on spending hundreds of billions of pounds that you don't have, and we're going to have to make some choices. And by choices, I don't mean that we don't spend taxpayers' money on priorities, just that you have to have priorities. Everything can't be a priority. And I still see the fundamental dispute being in place, which is every time we have a debate in Parliament about anything, Labour's approach is still spend loads of money. It's like yesterday on COVID. We made a choice on testing. You can't keep spending £2 billion a month on testing millions of asymptomatic people when you have fantastic protections with vaccines and antivirals. You just can't keep spending that money. There are other things to spend it on. Fixing the elective surgery backlog, improving the opportunities for people. But Labour's approach was, let's keep doing the testing. And I just think you've got to make some choices about where you spend the money. And for me, I want to spend the money on improving opportunities for people, giving people better opportunities to reach their potential. And those are the choices we're going to have to set out in the next election. You can't make everything a priority. And Labour is still, taxpayers' money is a bottomless pit, and you can just keep spending on everything and not making choices. And that is the debate for the next election. And I think if that's the debate, then we'll win it.
It's the debate now in this Parliament, though, as well, isn't it? As you say, you made significant promises at the last election to level up this country, and you have to be honest that that comes with spending commitments that have not been made. You know, you mentioned schools and skills earlier. I have a school in my constituency that doesn't have hot running water and can't afford to fix it. That is the reality of continued austerity under this Conservative government. The levelling up for transport across the north, the integrated rail plan, was a significant downgrading of the promises that were made in 3 consecutive Tory manifestos. So, yes, of course, spending decisions have to be made according to priorities, but you are not investing them as promised at the last general election. It's not just a question for the next one, it's a question for this Parliament now. And that is the fundamental tension, as I mentioned earlier, at the heart of this Parliamentary Conservative Party between those MPs that were elected on that manifesto and Rishi Sunak, who wants to pursue spending cuts.
But do you accept the characterisation on testing, for example? COVID testing?
I think, well, questions were made yesterday about testing because we are not, the pandemic is not over, and refusing testing for symptomatic people does not feel like a sensible decision at the moment.
Oh, okay.
You want to keep spending £2 billion a month on testing? It's not sustainable.
Why? I mean, keeping them there for symptomatic people at the moment, until we are absolutely through the pandemic, is not according to the scientific advice.
Look, this whole argument that Keir Starmer had yesterday, this football thing that he tries to crowbar about 10 minutes ago, the argument about COVID that I've been making is COVID it's not going to be over in 10 minutes. It's a disease that's with us forever.
Yeah.
We've got protections with vaccines and antivirals. You can't keep operating in an emergency position. We've got to get back to normal and start focusing on getting the NHS dealing with the backlogs and recognising, coming back to your point, that if you spend £400 billion on protecting people through a pandemic, you are going to have to cut your cloth accordingly.
Okay.
And there are going to be things that you aren't able to do or as quickly as you wanted to do, recognising that reality. And I think the public do want politicians to be honest with them and straightforward about the choices and the realities.
Do either of you want to tell us where public opinion is on this argument we've just heard?
Well, public opinion at the moment seems to be slightly more towards the Labour position than the Conservative position. But, you know, as we know, things switch around. I mean, I've been looking at public opinion on COVID. At the moment, I'm sort of looking at it in the spring of 2020, and, you know, Boris Johnson was seen to be doing fantastically well. You know, and there was a huge amount of support for what the government were doing. A few months later, you know, that collapsed. So it moves around an awful lot.
Right, we've got time for a final question, and literally you've got about a minute each. It's from Simon Usherwood, and the question is, have either the Tories or Labour worked out what Brexit is for yet?
Well, look, Brexit was about fundamentally who makes the laws in your country, and the decision that the public made was that we wanted to make the decisions affecting people's lives in the British Parliament here and not accept lots of laws being made as a compromise in the European Union. That was the fundamental question. It was the take back control question. And that comes with costs and opportunities. And our challenge is to make the most of the opportunities, which I think Tim referenced. Some ministers have been setting those out. The Treasury, I think, has done a lot to improve our ability to attract financial businesses here.
Jacob
And we need to see,
now, isn't it?
and we need to see more of that in the coming years. Yeah.
Have you worked out what Brexit's about?
Well, I think it's pretty pathetic that Jacob Rees-Mogg had to go and ask Sun readers if they could think of any Brexit opportunities for him to help deliver in this government. Look, there are of course opportunities. We've set out that the Tories should cut VAT on energy bills at the moment in order to help them through the coming energy bill crisis, but ultimately, as I said earlier, as Keir set out in his Labour Party conference speech, we have to now make Brexit work, and that is not being achieved with Boris Johnson's endless antagonism and casual threats towards Europe, not least around the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Yeah, I mean, it was close, 52 to 48. Has the nation worked out what Brexit's for yet?
No, I don't think so. I don't think anyone in this room necessarily has. I think the Tories, if there is a Tory answer to what Brexit is for, it's the one Ben Houchen, the sort of slightly inconsistent answer Ben Houchen has settled on in the Tees Valley, which is that it allows the government to both be a government of statist intervention and a government that deregulates quite aggressively. So that's why, you have a mayor in the Tees Valley that both nationalises and throws massive state subsidies at an airport, but is also very, very into free ports. But crucially, Ben Houchen has a story to tell to his electorate, which is why he was elected, and tangible achievements to point to, which is why he was re-elected with 73, North Korean-style margin of sort of 73% of the vote last May. The challenge for Labour, and which Louise just picked up on there, is to find progressive advantages to Brexit. And I know the chorus of responses here might be, well, there aren't any. There clearly are things that Labour can embrace or lean into, given that it is clearly not politically possible to reverse Brexit anytime soon, and it's not a feasible or advisable electoral position for Labour to go in saying they're going to do that. It's about finding Brexit dividends that they can sell to the public as distinctively Labour positions.
Well, I think for the Conservative Party, it was about making sure that there wasn't a disruptive challenger on its right flank, which meant that it might lose a general election. And so far, it's proved very successful in that sense.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Tim, Patrick, Louise and Mark very much indeed. We're going straight on to the next session with a different panel, so please stay in your seats, but thank you all very much.